We're operating at a period in history when there are many changes going on in how court systems are responding to divorce and child custody. And there's an inadequate attention to how those changes are affecting children who've grown up being exposed to abuse. And that would include children who've been abused directly as they were growing up by one of their parents. And it would include children who've grown up witnessing a man abusing their mother, which unfortunately is a very, very common part of children's experience. And abuse of the mother or abuse of the children is one of the top causes of divorce. And it is particularly prevalent in divorces that are very hard to resolve, where there ends up being a great tension between the parents, where it's hard to reach agreements, where tensions remain high even years after the couple has split up. Those most commonly are cases that involve abuse. And so the efforts that are happening in various places around the globe to promote shared parenting, to try to work on how to have both parents more involved with the children post-divorce, are by and large not working to have the kinds of effects that policymakers wish they would have. And in fact, the impact on children very heavily is much worse than the situation as it was before there were these attempts towards shared parenting. And I'll explain various aspects of why that's the case and talk about what would a post-separation plan look like that really makes sense for children who have witnessed abuse or who have been abused themselves, or both, because they're in homes where the mother is being abused. There's also a great increased likelihood that the children are being abused. So my focus is going to be on domestic abuse, where one of the parents is abusing the other, and that's most commonly going to be a male abusing a female. And I will talk some about the abuse of children, but primarily in a context where the mother is also being abused. So the first question that policymakers have to consider is, what are the effects on children of growing up in a home where their mother is being abused? And we have a mountain of research that has accumulated over the past 20 to 25 years, showing that it's tremendously, tremendously stressful for children to live in conditions where their father or any man is abusing their mother, even if the children are not themselves being abused by either parent. That just growing up in that atmosphere takes a tremendous toll on children. Though the circumstance of watching their mother being psychologically torn down and sometimes physically attacked, and of hearing her being threatened, these experiences are very painful for children, and they're long-lasting in their effects. And so the research shows us that children who grow up in an environment where a man is abusing their mother are really showing almost all the same effects over time that children are showing from being abused themselves. So they're showing higher rates of depression, they're showing higher rates of self-harming behaviors, they're showing higher rates of withdrawal, in other words, not developing normal peer relationships, not being a normal part of their society. They're showing higher rates of problems learning at school. They're showing higher rates of problems in their behavior at school. They're showing higher rates of involvement in drugs and alcohol as they get older. They're showing higher involvements in running away as teenagers from home, and different kinds of truancy and delinquent behavior involved in committing of crimes as teenagers. Their development is often slowed, so they're behind where the stages they should be at for their age, in their emotional development, in their cognitive development. And they're much more likely to be involved in violence. They're much more likely to be involved in violence towards peers. These children are involved in more violence than other kids, both as perpetrators of that violence and as victims of the violence. And in other words, they're not just more likely to be bullies, but they're more likely to be bullied. And for males who grow up in a home where their mother's being abused, they're very likely to be involved, particularly starting in their teenage years, with violence towards females, both physical violence and sexual violence towards females. And they're much more likely than other children, both boys and girls, to be violent towards their mothers. This is what's been modeled for them, is to tear her down. Now, there are other huge sources of stress in the lives of children whose mother is being abused. One is that it's very painful to watch their father being psychologically cruel to her. In other words, the incidents of violence typically will happen once or twice or 3 times a year, sometimes even less than that. And those experiences when their mother gets assaulted are horrible for children, but that's not the most common experience for them. What is happening for them week in and week out is that they are watching their mother being torn down verbally. They're watching her humiliated. They're watching their father tell her that she's stupid, that she's incompetent, that she doesn't know what she's doing. They're watching him ruin meals that she's trying to prepare. They're watching him forbid her from seeing certain people that she wants to see. And so the children are suffering from seeing that their mother is being put into emotional pain. And they're suffering from the terrible unfairness of it. It's very, very painful for children to watch someone that they love be mistreated. Children don't even want to watch a family pet be mistreated. They don't like seeing an animal mistreated. It's awful for them when it's their own mother being mistreated. And so they feel the unfairness and cruelty of the psychological treatment towards their mother very, very acutely. And that takes a big toll on them. But then they also struggle with the question of whether she is actually the one who's responsible for the abusive man's actions. Because part of how abusive men function in the home, and I've written about this a lot in my books, is that they are day in and day out sending the message that they are not responsible for their own actions, that their swearing and their threats and their harsh, mean criticisms and their violence are all being caused by other family members. In other words, it's a mentality of, you're making me do this. You're causing me to behave in these ways. I can't help it. It's not my fault. It's your fault. And this atmosphere that he deliberately creates causes tremendous confusion for children. And to some extent, they start to believe that he's right, and that mom is causing his bad behaviors, and that they themselves, the children, are causing his bad behaviors. And though that confusion for the children is deepening the psychological effects of witnessing the violence, it's also starting to cause all kinds of problems in their own lives, because they're starting to be very, very confused about ethics and morality. And they're starting to believe that they aren't responsible for their own actions. They're starting to believe that other people aren't responsible for their actions. And they're starting to learn a whole culture of blaming females specifically for male behavior. And these dynamics tend to be completely overlooked when people think about questions of custody and visitation, about post-separation contact between an abusive man, a domestic violence perpetrator, and his children, because people tend to focus just on, well, how are the kids doing with the trauma that they may have experienced during physical assaults, the fear and the distress, the nightmares they may have had afterwards, the other traumatic effects. And it is very important to attend to those questions, but those are one small part of what we have to consider when we decide to put children in an extensive program of post-separation contact with their father who has a history of abusing their mother. we are inadvertently sending those children a message that he's a responsible, good parent. I mean, they're being sent to spend a lot of time with him. That sends them that message. And that's going to increase their tendency to believe that he's probably right, that they were to blame for what he did, and that mom was to blame for what he did to her. And that's going to cause long-term problems in all these different ways that I've described, and is going to cause long-term problems in their relationships with their mother. And really the number one lasting damage that we see from the post-separation contact that children have with their abusive fathers is lasting and profound damage to the children's relationships with their mother. And that's ending up causing a huge part of the negative post-separation effects that we're seeing on children of this contact. And there's a widespread failure among policymakers when they're thinking about, well, we're going to get, we're going to have the father more involved, we're going to have both parents more involved. There's a failure to look at what are we going to do with the fact that domestic violence perpetrators are determined to damage children's relationship with their mother and are highly successful for a number of different reasons at doing so. They not only want to do it, but they can do it. It would be a longer discussion for me to explain why they have so much ability to do so much damage to the mother's relationship. The reason why they have the desire to do that damage is because they're abusive, and abusers are very revenge oriented. But the reason they have so much ability to do so has to do with how traumatized the children already are, and it has to do with a huge power imbalance that exists between the parents in a domestic violence case. And it has to do with how much indoctrinating the children he's already done before the couple has even split up. So there are many factors. I don't have time to go into those in detail now. But our number one concern in a domestic violence case, in the post-separation context, should be protecting these children's psychological relationship, emotional relationship with their mother, and protecting the children's relationships with each other, because abusers also create tremendous division between siblings. And I unfortunately rarely see policymakers addressing this concern, though it should be our number one concern in any way, in how they're talking about laws and plans and structures for trying to promote shared parenting, as they say, in the post-separation context. So those are some essential points that I think need much more attention in understanding the impacts on children of exposure to domestic abuse, and trying to structure what kind of post-separation contact do we want those children to have with this person that we either strongly suspect or actually now know for a fact is a perpetrator of domestic abuse and has been tearing the mother down psychologically for years. And I continue to emphasize this is the main concern. The physical violence is a very serious concern. The sexual violence is a very serious concern. But even greater than either of those is his long history of tearing this mother down in a psychological sense, and the implications of that for both mom and children and for child development. So the next question then we want to look at is, so we have a case, let's say, that we think might be a case where there's a history of domestic abuse or abuse of the children, and we're trying to figure out, well, A, is this really a case of domestic abuse? And B, if so, how serious a case is it? And how do we know if these are children who'd be okay to spend quite a bit of unsupervised time with the domestic violence perpetrator? So It's important to have a system in place that's actually in any kind of code or policy that says how that assessment must be done. Because what happens currently around the globe is that assessment is done on the basis of myth and misconception about domestic abuse. It's often done using very outmoded psychological theories and psychological theories that aren't applicable to child abuse or the abuse of women, domestic abuse. And as a result, decisions get made that are based on entirely spurious thinking about how you would know whether this is a serious case or not. The most common mistake that gets made is to assume that the severity of the domestic violence is determined by the severity of the physical violence that the man has perpetrated against the woman. And that is one important factor, but it is only one of many important factors in determining whether this is the kind of case where children are going to suffer severe psychological harm if they have an extensive program of contact with their father, with the domestic violence perpetrator. I wrote a book called The Batterer as Parent, which is available in Japanese, where in one of the chapters, in chapter 7, I lay out in great detail exactly what the assessment process should look like for determining whether an abuse perpetrator should have extensive contact with children. And I would encourage policymakers to actually put that system into code, because what we have found in the United States and in multiple other countries is that unless you make very specific rules about what evaluators are required to do and what steps judges are required to take before they grant unsupervised contact with children to an abuse perpetrator, unless you've laid out very specifically what they need to do, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do proper assessment. They're going to make their decisions, unfortunately, based on a number of other factors. I'll come back and talk about that later, that are the wrong factors on which to be making that decision. And with the questions we have to look at are questions such as, what is his ability to actually focus on the children's needs? How much has he been cruel to their mother, not just physically violent, but cruel to their mother, where their children could see it and hear it? In other words, what is his history of doing behaviors right in front of the children? What is his history of deliberately involving the children in those events? Doing things like saying, now children, you're going to see your mother get a punishment, or no children, you're not leaving the room because you want to see what happens when mom behaves this way. Requiring the children to report to him on her behavior while he's been away. That directly involves them in his abusiveness. So we need to know what's his history of that. We need to know what is his history of trying to damage children's relationship with their mother. Does he already have a history of trying to turn moms and children against each other, or trying to turn the siblings against each other? Does he have a chronic history of undermining her authority, of making it very hard for her to parent her children because he tells the children that they don't have to do what she told them to do? And so she's gradually lost her maternal authority. Does he have a history of using the children as weapons against her? For example, does he hurt the children physically or psychologically when he wishes to upset her, as a way to be, in other words, is he mean to the children as a way to be mean to her? And these are just a few examples of multiple factors. Oh, what is his drug and alcohol use? How dangerous is he? Because some abusers who have not necessarily used a high level of physical violence measure very high on all the other measures of potential for lethality. Because when you do a proper assessment of an abuser's risk of lethality, it involves many, many factors beyond just how much actual violence has he committed. Some domestic abuse perpetrators who commit homicide do so without that severe a prior history of violence, but they showed all kinds of other warning signs of being potential killers. So has a proper danger assessment been done? and so forth and so forth. That's as much detail as I should give for now. As I say, you can look in the book, The Batterer as Parent, in the chapter 7, and it's laid right out the kind of assessment that needs to happen. And there are a couple of other things I want to say about assessment. One is that anyone who's performing assessment has to know the domestic violence issues specifically. And what's happening in the US and other places is that psychologists end up providing these assessments as you would for other kinds of issues where the person has no understanding of the dynamics of domestic violence. And in particular, there's a tendency to call these cases high conflict divorces. And that term has become very, very widespread in use. And it's unfortunately a very misleading term because, first of all, there's a remarkable lack of research into these so-called high conflict cases. But they also fail to separate out cases that involve a history of the abuse of the children or abuse towards mother. It doesn't make any sense to refer to a case as a high conflict divorce when the issue is that one parent is trying to protect her children from the other parent. The problem there is not the conflict. The problem there is the abuser. And when we call it a high conflict divorce, we're naming the conflict as the problem rather than the history of abuse as a problem. And what happens when you make that mistaken frame is that your focus becomes how to help resolve the conflict between the parents, rather than how do we hold the abuser accountable and get him or her to change, require that person to change. And this is really the predominant mistake in divorce work globally at the moment, is to be focused on resolving conflict, which is relevant for other kinds of tense divorces, but is not relevant for divorces that involve a history of abuse. And most really tense, in other words, lastingly tense divorces do involve histories of abuse. So the whole notion of high conflict divorce is actually focused on a very small percentage of cases. There is not a large percentage of cases that are very hard, where the divorce remains very hard to resolve years later, unless there's a history of abuse towards the children or abuse towards mom. And tensions are often very difficult to resolve in the immediate aftermath as the couple is breaking up and for the next 1 to 2 years. But overwhelmingly, those tensions go down as the years go by if there's not an abuser in the picture. When there is an abuser in the picture, you cannot somehow teach communication skills or teach conflict resolution skills. This is a huge error that is made so much in the divorce and custody field, is to look at these cases and say, oh, well, this man has very poor conflict resolution skills. He has very poor communication skills. Or often they blame the couple. They say the couple is lacking in these skills. And so we're going to teach them these skills. And that's a completely misguided response to a domestic abuse case, because his lack of skills is not the issue. His abusiveness is the issue. He can have all the skills in the world. He's not going to use them because he's a bully. And so the fundamental frame of how we do assessment has to be governed by our policies, because our policies need to say, if there's a history of abuse or even allegations of a history of abuse, those allegations have to be properly investigated. Here's the steps. Here's what the investigation needs to look like. And then here are the concerns that have to be addressed before a parenting plan is made. So. Next, I'll talk some about the trends with respect to joint parental rights and shared custody of children. So first of all, one of the big myths that you'll hear is that children do better in joint custody, and that studies have shown that children do better in joint custody. In other words, very equal or roughly equal involvement of both parents. Well, that's not what the studies show. What the studies show is that the children do very well in shared custody and in shared parenting when that has been voluntarily arrived at by the parents. There's no evidence that forcing parents into shared parenting is in children's best interest. There's very extensive evidence that it's not in children's best interest, that it works out badly for them. In fact, what I would say the research really indicates is that the parenting plan isn't really what determines how well children do. What determines how well children do is, do they have two kind and responsible parents who can reasonably well get along with each other after divorce? Or are they dealing with either a parent who's abusive or dealing with two parents who absolutely cannot get along with each other no matter what? In other words, children do better when their parents get along well. And we can't mandate that. There's no way to legislate parents being on good terms post-separation. You certainly can't legislate a mother being on good terms with the man who has abused her post-separation, because that's just simply not possible for her to do unless he changes, unless he actually gets intervened with and deals with his abusiveness, unless he actually confronts his abusiveness. The only way to get along with an abuser is to capitulate, is to just let him have whatever he wants. That's the only way you can get along with an abuser. And that's not in the best interest of children to let an abuser make the decisions. That's never going to serve them well. An abuser thinks only about himself and what he wants. He does not think well about what's good for kids and couldn't care at all about what's good for their mothers. So when you think you see, oh, shared parenting is really what's best for children, what you're actually seeing is that parents who get along well post-divorce are what's best for children, and those are the parents that choose shared parenting. So the shared parenting is actually one of the effects of the fact that the parents get along reasonably well, that they're having, a reasonably peaceful divorce. It's not the cause of why the children are doing well. The children are doing well because parents get along, and that's why they're sharing parenting. And sure, having two very loving, responsible parents involved with you is better than one. 3 is better than 2, and 4 is better than 3, and so forth. But the idea that somehow that we can mandate more involvement of both parents, and that's somehow going to lead to good impacts for children, is very misguided. And the outcome research is still so inadequate about what happens post-divorce, even in our times. It's odd how little research there is about this. But I've told you essentially what we know so far from what that research shows, except that what the research also shows is that divorce is deeply disruptive to children's lives. It just messes everything up. It messes up their relationships with their friends, and they may have to change what schools they're going to and which parent they're spending time with. And that's one of the greatest sources of pain and confusion and distress for children, is just massive disruption to everything. So one of our main goals post-separation is to look for ways to reduce disruption. And what that means is we want to try to let children's lives look as much as possible the way they did before the divorce. So if children were living in one home, then we would like them still to have a primary residence in one home where they spend the bulk of their time. And we would like them not to be constantly going back and forth between two houses for these very extensive programs of visitation, which are nice for the visiting parent, but are not good for the children. I mean, it's common in our times, it's popular in our times to have these schedules where children are spending Tuesday afternoon with dad and Thursday afternoon with dad and Friday and Saturday night with him. And then it's just this constant back and forth and back and forth. And they're trying to figure out, oh, where are my school books? Oh, when can I see my friends? Oops, I left these things that I need over at the other house, and so forth. So disruptive to them. And it means that with respect to contact with the parents, the we need to not think that the goal is for them to have the most possible time with both parents, but what the goal actually is for them to have roughly the same amount of time with each parent that they had before. So if before the divorce, they were spending 90% of their time with one parent and 10% of their time with the other, then it'd be best to keep it looking pretty much like that after the divorce. If parenting was truly 50-50, and there are families where parenting is truly 50-50, truly half shared between each parent, well then yes, post-divorce it would be good to have it still be pretty 50-50. But the current push from so many policy places is to say, oh, well, we want to push towards 50-50 parenting. That has nothing to do with what's good for children, because that was almost never the structure before divorce. And we want to keep it we want to try to approximate how things were before divorce. That's what's going to be the least disruptive to children's lives. That's what's going to be the least disruptive to their hearts. It's what's going to allow them to continue to have the same nature of emotional relationships that they had before with their mother and their father, and reduce the disruption to their relationship with their siblings and to their relationships with their friends and other key emotional contacts, emotional connections in their lives. Joint custody in the United States is not working at all. It's just an unmitigated disaster. And it's unfortunately continues to be heavily promoted, and the kinds of misleading arguments that I have described to you today continue to be very widely made. And the outcome is disastrous. But what I'm eager to draw your attention to is that the outcome is excellent for lawyers, psychologists, mediators, visitation supervisors, all these different roles that are being created. The system is making money in a way that is unbelievable. I'm in shock where this is compared to where it was 30 years ago in the United States. This is a vast, what we call a cash cow, where suddenly so many different professionals have discovered, oh, there's a fortune to be made off of divorce. And the whole concept of shared parenting, what it really does is keep unhealthy parents involved. And that allows all these professionals to make an unbelievable amount of money, because it guarantees that there's going to be tension and fighting for years. It guarantees that the children are going to be in tremendous distress and they're going to need psychologists. It guarantees that the tension between the parents will not get less. In fact, the involvement of all these lawyers and evaluators helps keep things really tense between the parents. It doesn't help resolve tensions between the parents. It helps keep fanning the flames. And so that these battles go on much greater length than they used to. But then this becomes a driving force, unfortunately, towards keeping these new policies in place, is that these powerful psychologists, lawyers, evaluators, mediators are making so much money that they then are making sure that no changes come to laws and no changes come to policies. So I'm really kind of trying to wave a big warning flag to folks in Japan. It's really important to keep an eye on this situation right from the beginning, because once the shared parenting thing really gets rolling, then so much money is being made, so much profit is being made and going into the pockets of greedy people, that then it becomes very hard to stop, because people who are making a lot of money then also start to have a lot of influence over policy because they've got a lot of money. And so I'm really eager to see folks in Japan head this thing off and have the primary focus be on how do we disrupt children's lives as little as possible. How do we disrupt children's lives as little as possible? How do we keep the post-separation, post-divorce parenting plan looking as much as possible like what the pre-divorce, what the parenting plan looked like when the couple was together? And how do we hold abusers accountable for their actions and send them the message that they can't keep treating people this way, that they can't keep abusing children. And if there's a man abusing a woman, to send the message that he can't keep abusing the woman. And that's a very different focus than where things are heading currently. There has, in my experience, in place after place, country after country, region after region within the United States, everywhere, we hear over and over again from judges, from policymakers, from evaluators, oh, well, we won't apply this new way of thinking to domestic violence cases. We'll separate out those domestic violence cases and those child abuse cases. And in practice, it does not happen. In practice, instead, what these systems do is develop whole ideologies, whole systems for saying, oh, well, this isn't a domestic violence case, or this isn't a child abuse case, or we're not going to believe these reports, and don't separate those cases out. I wrote about this problem also in detail in The Batterer's Parent, in chapter 6 of The Batterer's Parent. I wrote extensively about the problem of how all these reports of abuse, child abuse, and of abuse towards the mother get dismissed and rejected by evaluators and lawyers and judges. And so the promise that, oh, we'll make an exception for those cases does not happen. And so I would like you to be really on alert when you hear that claim start to be made, because I've watched this in country after country after country, and it doesn't happen. A couple of other points I want to make. The granting of visiting rights, of parental rights to grandparents, in other words, the parents of the parents, is by and large not working in children's best interests. The abuser, in an abuse case, the abuser is very often using his parents as a way to get more access to his children. In other words, he gets his parents to go fight for their rights to visit, for their parental rights, and then he uses that as a way for him to get more contact with the children. He also uses that as a way just to continue tormenting the woman, because now she's not only dealing with litigation involving her ex, she's dealing with litigation involving her ex's parents, because they're demanding time with the children also. And grandparent visitation only makes sense for kids who've been severely abused directly by their parents. And their parents are then preventing, the previous generation are preventing them from seeing the children. In other words, a mother or father who abuses the children and then won't let her own loving parents see those children. That's got nothing to do with the kind of cases we're talking about. And it's not, leading to anything helpful. And then the last comment I'll make is that in the United States, this was a long time ago now, decades ago, when there was a broad decision to get much tougher about child support enforcement. We started, for example, to garnish wages, which I know is something that you would like to see happen in Japan, where the court simply makes an order that the child support is to be taken directly out of the man's paycheck before he even gets his paycheck, so that they don't have to wait for him to pay or hope that he'll pay. Unfortunately, the crackdown on child support has had very mixed effects in the United States. I was in favor of it at the time. It seemed like such a good thing. But unfortunately, what it's actually done is greatly increase the investment that abusive men have, that domestic violence perpetrators have, in retaliating. Because they take the attitude of like, well, if I'm going to have to pay child support, then I'm going to go to court and demand shared custody or even primary custody of my children. And so unfortunately, child support enforcement has turned out to be a huge motivator for abusers to demand to stay involved in children's lives. And when abusers went away and didn't pay child support, that had terrible economic effects on the children. But in so many ways, it was actually kind of better for the abuser to wander away. And I don't know what the solution is to that. It's a really, really tricky question. well, the solution to that would be to have tough child support enforcement and really good policies that didn't allow abusers to get extensive programs of involvement with their children. But that's a tough one to win. So that's where I will stop. I don't know that much about it. I do see some signs of change coming in the UK, but I don't know that much about it. No, in the US, the situation has become more and more and more entrenched. It's gonna take a huge rebellion by women in the United States to have any chance of changing it here, because it got itself so systemically entrenched. The amount of money that's being made just grows each year. It is. It's an industry now. One thing I'll send you that could be useful to you is a list that I just brainstormed of what sort of positive court reforms would look like, and what sorts of things should we be demanding that the courts do. And you can look at that and see if there's anything in there that is relevant to the Japanese situation that would be useful to you. It's just a brainstorm list. I never turned it into an article or anything like that. It's just a. And this is really essential in public education and in confronting professionals and everything else, to make people understand that abusers are, without exception, very psychologically cruel to women, and that in fact that's what women report does the most harm to them, is his psychological cruelty. I mean, in fact, I mean, there's research showing that the best predictor of which men will use violence towards women is what their level of verbal abuse is towards women. So the whole notion that somehow we can think of those two things as two separate issues is false, because not everybody is verbally abusive, and people who are really verbally abusive are actually men who are quite verbally abusive are really prone to be physically or sexually violent to women as well. Those two tend to come hand in hand.